Africana, Fanti Confederation.
Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, You either run and do it, or you're running from it. Tell me, brother, where you're running? You're either running scared, or you're running free. Tell me, sister, how you running? If you're the big tree, and all the small legs, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away. Call me timber, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Only way to kill a beast to attack the root. Pull it up from the ground and destroy the fruit. You're either telling lies or you're telling truth. Tell me, brother, sister, what do you do? If you're the big tree, and I'm the small legs, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away. Call me timber, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Almost out of time, gotta free your mind. Almost out of time, gotta feed the mind. Everything we do today, sow the seeds for the next day. Sow the seed for the next day, the next day, the next day. Almost out of time, gotta free your mind. Almost out of time, gotta feed the mind. Everything we do today, sow the seeds for the next day. Sow the seeds for the next day, the next day, the next day. Off with this head, off with this head, off with this head, off with this head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with this head, off with this head, off with this head, off with this head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete,
hide my tears from the crowd by smiling.
Shirley Graham Du Bois. In 1896, Lola Shirley Graham Du Bois was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, to Reverend David A. Graham and Elizabeth Etta Graham. As a young girl, Du Bois was taught the importance of opposing personal and social injustices within her community. She showed her brilliance as a 13-year-old when she wrote an editorial for the Indianapolis newspaper protesting the discrimination she experienced. She was fueled to write the editorial because she was denied access to a public pool at her local YMCA. Early in her life, Du Bois and her family lived in 5 different cities before settling in Spokane, Washington. While living in Spokane, Washington, Du Bois graduated from Lewis and Clark High School, then moved to Seattle, Washington. While in Seattle, she met and married her first husband, Shadrach McCants. The couple had 2 sons before divorcing in 1927. By 1931, Du Bois sought the help of her parents to help raise her children while she attended graduate school. She was able to earn her master's degree in fine arts and music history at Oberlin College. Du Boys also at the Columbia University, Howard University, and Morgan State University briefly before earning her master's degree. In 1932, as a student at Oberlin College, Du Bois' three-act, 16-scene opera, Tom Toms, an epic of music and the Negro, debuted at Cleveland Stadium, drawing a crowd of 10,000 people. Her second showing of her opera drew a crowd of 15,000 people, one of which was the governor of Ohio, Newton Baker. Du Bois' opera Tom Toms made her the first African American to write and produce an all-black cast opera. Shirley Du Bois never forgot her passion for helping to end racism in her communities. Her political activism found her being fired as the director of the YWCA USO in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Because Du Bois stood up for the protesters of the death of 3 black soldiers, she lost her job. Because of her versatile skill set, she was hired quickly by the NAACP as a field secretary. As a field secretary, she was responsible for organizing new NAACP branches across the U.S. In 1944, Du Bois released her first biography titled Dr. George Washington Carver, Scientist. She would then release 2 more biographies, a biography of Paul Robeson, followed by a biography of Frederick Douglass. Later, Du Bois would become one of the founders of the Progressive Party. Du Bois and the Progressive Party would become consultants to former Vice President Henry Wallace. Wallace would later run for president under the banner of the Progressive Party. By the 1940s, Shirley Du Bois would become reacquainted with her childhood friend, W.E.B. Du Bois. Shirley and W.E.B. would date for a while before getting married in 1951 in New York City. The couple's love and loyalty was tested as they continuously fought legal battles because of alleged connections with the Communist Party. In 1961, Shirley and W.E.B. would give up their American citizenship and move to Ghana. W.E.B. Du Bois would die in Ghana in 1963 in the city of Accra. Shirley Du Bois remained in Accra until her friend Kwame Nkrumah's regime was overthrown in 1966. Her next move was to Cairo, Egypt, where she lived until moving to Beijing, China. Before she moved to Beijing, she traveled throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe fighting imperialism and colonialism. Shirley Du Bois chose to counter racism by becoming an example of an active activist. She was not one to only complain about injustice, she chose to combat injustices to blacks and others around the world. Miss Lola Shirley Graham Du Bois, we stand on your shoulders.
Hello. Can y'all hear me? I think you can hear me. I see the audio working. But hopefully you can hear me. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, rather. Welcome. My name is Onyezanu. I am an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, or the AAPRP. The AAPRP is a revolutionary Pan-African socialist mass political party based in Africa, founded in Africa over 50 years ago by Kwame Nkrumah. And I am speaking to y'all from occupied Tiwa territory because I am part of the New Mexico chapter of the APRP. But this is weekly Pan-African news. And as I was preparing for the show today, I was like, man, we probably have to rename it because it's not weekly anymore. If you missed this last week, that's because we are not doing these shows on the second and fourth Thursday of each month instead of every single week. So maybe it's like bi-weekly Pan-African news, but that's such a terrible name. But anywho, this is weekly Pan-African news presented to you by APRP New Mexico. We do this show, like I said, on the second and fourth Thursday of every month. We've been doing it for just about 2 years now, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown here in the United States. We realized very quickly that African people were going to be the most dramatically impacted, or among the most dramatically impacted by COVID in the United States. We realized we could not gather our people in person because it wasn't going to be safe anymore. So we were like, how can we continue to build with y'all? And this show is one of several ideas we came up with to do it, and it's been a great success. And we appreciate all the folks that tune in every week with us to learn. But if you are a frequent watcher of the show, then, oh, thank you. Thanks so much. I had to do it big. I had to do the lipstick and the earrings. I just felt like it. But I appreciate y'all. Good morning, Ricky. Good morning, Pilo. Good morning, Jamila. Great to see y'all. Please like the stream and please share the stream so you can get more eyes on this. But if you are a frequent watcher of the show, then you know that we always start off with a couple of things. First is the intro, which I just did, where I tell you who the heck I am and what the heck this is. Second thing that we always do is that we always call in an ancestor. We call in a revolutionary ancestor to honor the people that came before us, to honor the folks that did the work that made it possible for us to be engaged in the struggle today. Today I tried something a little bit different. You just watched a video from our comrades from On the Shoulders of Giants on YouTube about Miss Shirley Graham Du Bois, talking about her life. Today is actually her birthday. She was born November 11th, 1896. So she was born on this day quite some time ago. And what I really appreciated about that video is that oftentimes when you hear about Shirley Graham Du Bois, you hear about her as like a corollary to her husband. They're like, oh yeah, that was W.B. Du Bois' wife. Like she had nothing else going on. Like he was like the main character and she was just like along for the ride. But what that video lays out is that she was an extremely accomplished revolutionary African in her own right. She had a long history of contributions to the struggle made independently, made long before she was ever married to W.B. Du Bois. We don't want to take anything away from W.B. Du Bois. He was a great Pan-Africanist. He made his own contributions. But the point is, she wasn't just his wife. She was her own person. She made her own contributions. After he passed, she was still working. She was still putting in work for the African liberation struggle. So I just really appreciate that framing because oftentimes, you know, as women, as marginalized gender people under patriarchy, we're like treated like appendages of the dudes around us. Like I've been dating, and dating in your 30s is really people trying to like lock you down. And like a lot of dudes have that mindset where they're like, I would like you to be the side character in my main story. And I'm like, no, thank you. So yeah, I just appreciate all upliftings of the memories of revolutionary African women that center the independent contributions of those women. She wasn't just his wife. She was a revolutionary on her own. And a really good book to read about her, if you want to learn more about Shirley Graham Du Bois, which you should, is actually the cover was like pictured in the video. It's called Race Women by Gerald Horne, prolific Pan-African, revolutionary African historian. But please check that out. Please learn more about her. Please understand she wasn't just a wife. She was a revolutionary woman, period. Period, point blank. Anywho, so that's the ancestor. Again, Shirley Graham Du Bois, born on this day in 1896. We honor her. We lift her up. We are grateful to her for all the work she put in to make the struggle possible today. The last thing that we always do in every single episode is that we want to acknowledge that we are speaking to y'all from stolen land, from occupied land. In fact, the entire Western Hemisphere was stolen from indigenous nations by force from these raggedy European colonizers, who are actually the same folks that stole land across the entire continent of Africa, the same folks that stole land in occupied Palestine, the same folks that stole land in Hawaii, in Australia. These people went all over the world stealing people's land and jacking it up, creating a climate crisis, privatizing the commons, dooming us into this current timeline. So when we do a land acknowledgement, we're not saying it just to say it. We're saying it because we understand that we are part of a global struggle of colonized peoples all over this planet fighting to get their land back from the capitalists and the imperialists and the colonizers. When we do a land acknowledgement, we are not saying it to just to say it. We are saying it as a promise. We are saying it as a political objective. We are saying it to declare our mission, to declare our unconditional solidarity with all oppressed and colonized peoples from Africa to Turtle Island to Palestine, fighting to get their land back. Land was taken and land will be returned. That is a promise. So yeah, we just did the intro. We just did the what is this? We just did the ancestor, again, Shirley Graham Du Bois, and that was the land acknowledgement. So the next thing we want to get into is the thing that we do every single episode, the meat of the episode, if you will, and that is the political education segment. And you know that if you go to an APIP event anywhere on this planet, anywhere on this earth, you're going to get some aspect of political education. It is a mandatory component of the APIP's work. If you are a member of the APIP, you are constantly doing PE. If you're a member of the APIP, you're doing PE externally as well. So it's like the foundation of what we do in this world. And the reason for that is because we understand as revolutionary African people, as organizers trying to mobilize our people for a revolutionary struggle that you cannot mobilize a sleeping people. You must wake them up, and then you get some action, as ancestor Malcolm X said. And so political education is how we wake our folks up. Political education is how we build consciousness. Political education is how we build critical thinking skills. It is really like a foundational aspect of any revolutionary struggle. Like, you are straight up not going to win a revolution without engaging in political education work. It is mandatory. It's mandatory. So the PE topic for the show today is what we like to call the global African refugee crisis. The global African refugee crisis. And the reason why we call it that is because right now, as we speak, there are Africans who are undertaking a death or a life and death struggle to escape the African continent and make their way to Europe. There are Africans right now undertaking a life or death struggle, extremely dangerous journey through South America and Central America to the US border, trying to get in the United States. All over the world, there are African people fleeing their homes, undertaking desperate and extremely dangerous journeys to make it to imperialist countries, to find some kind of opportunity, to find some kind of access, to find some kind of way to live. And the reason why they're doing that is because the system of capitalism and imperialism has created unlivable conditions for African people all over this planet and for colonized peoples in general. We've talked already on the show several times about how US imperialism has created unlivable conditions in Haiti, how imperialism has created unlivable conditions in Honduras, how imperialism is attempting to create unlivable conditions in Cuba, in Zimbabwe, and throughout the world wherever colonized peoples exist. And so what we want to do in the show today is look at that at a macro level. Focus specifically on African people on this planet. Focus on why our people are leaving their homes. It's not by choice. Focus on why those conditions exist, and then talk about what we as revolutionary African people, what we as people who believe in justice can do to address these problems. So, last episode of the show, we talked about what we call the IPIC, which is, remember, it stands for the Industrial Police Military Intelligence Complex. It is basically a global network of spies, of police agencies, of military forces who are controlled by imperialist nations, banks, and corporations, and which exists to brutally repress African and colonized people. You must understand that the IPIC, which is again the Industrial Police Military Intelligence Complex, is connected directly to the global African refugee crisis, because those are the forces that are visiting the violence upon the Africans that are trying to reach these imperialist countries. Like I said, imperialism in Africa is the driving force behind why African people are fleeing. Imperialism works to create unlivable conditions across the global south, across the colonized world, and it does so in the name of extraction. It does so in the name of stealing land and resources. It does so in the name of privatizing that land and those resources. And all of that is done in the name of profit. These imperialist countries, these global corporations, these banks want every single part of this planet to be available for sale, to be available for them to generate wealth from it. And so in order to do that, they have to brutally repress the people living on the land and resources they want. They have to steal those land and resources. They have to force colonized governments to impose austerity measures, to take away safety nets that provide things like housing and food for people and healthcare for people. And basically all of that functions to create conditions that are unlivable for the most oppressed peoples on this planet. The other thing that's oftentimes happening that's driving this global African refugee crisis is the impact of imperialism. And what I mean by that is that if a nation is resisting imperialist domination, like for example, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe tried to take the land that was stolen from colonizers, and the response of the imperialist countries was to destroy Zimbabwe's economy with sanctions. We talked about how inflation drastically rose in Zimbabwe. We talked about how the Zimbabwean government didn't even have the money to run an election, didn't even have the money available to provide for the basic needs of its people. And the people in Zimbabwe certainly resisted that, but there was also, as a consequence, mass migration from Zimbabwe. mass migrations from countries that are being targeted by imperialism. When the sanctions and the demonization and the invasion become unbearable for the people living there, the people are forced to flee. So that's precisely what happened in Zimbabwe after Zimbabwe took the land back and they got sanctioned. That's precisely what happened in Haiti after RSD came to power and tried to raise the minimum wage and create the safety net. That's precisely what's currently happening to Venezuela after Venezuela tried to nationalize its oil, after Venezuela tried to build socialism, the U.S. implied sanctions that increased the poverty rate in Venezuela, that starved out the Venezuelan people, and now we see Venezuelan people fleeing their homes. This is what imperialism does. If a country dares to resist, imperialism responds by attacking the most vulnerable populations of that nation. And when those populations are attacked, the options on the table are for them to suffer or for them to find a way to survive. And that is why people are leaving their homes. It's not because they want to go. It's not because it's so much better in the United States or in Europe. It's not because they don't feel loyalty to their nations or to their people or because they're cutting and running. It's because imperialism is deliberately creating unlivable conditions in the name of profit in these nations. That's why people are leaving. But the other thing that's really important to understand is how colonialism worked in the first place to transform conditions in African nations and colonized nations all around the world. And what I mean by that is that before we were living under colonial domination, before imperialism and capitalism were the global economic system, we had our own value systems. We had our own societies that were aligned with life and nature, that valued life, that were humanistic, that were collective, where everybody had what we needed. We didn't have capitalist standards of wealth, but we did have situations where resources were available. Those resources were equitably distributed, where people had healthcare, where people had housing, where people had food. We had societies organized around life instead of around profit for a handful of people. We also had our own identities, our own cultures, our own systems of morality that said what was right and what was wrong. And when these colonizers came to our shores, when they worked to steal our land and our resources and our labor, and in the case of African people, our bodies, they also worked to destroy the cultures that existed before, to destroy the societies and practices and beliefs that were grounded in humanism and in life, and instead replace them with individualism, with the profit motive, with antagonism and disrespect to nature, with an idea that we have to dominate nature. All these things, these values were instilled into our societies by the colonizers, by the imperialists. And the consequence of them creating these foreign values, of their destroying our systems of morality, our belief systems, of destroying our unity, was that it caused us to question each other, to question ourselves, and begin to fight amongst ourselves. So the root of the conflict that imperialism has spread across the world, that colonization has spread across the world, is the destruction of indigenous belief systems and indigenous ways of organizing society. They replaced everything we knew with their reactionary and profit-centered system. And the consequence of that in the modern day is that we are fighting amongst ourselves. So imperialism goes in, tries to steal the land, steals the resources, steals the labor, steals the bodies, pushes our governments to impose austerity measures that destroy our safety nets, that take away housing, that take away healthcare, that take away safety. It forces the governments to open up their borders to capital and to investment. Again, all of the profit from that, none of it goes to the people, all of it goes to these corporations. And it also creates an attitude of every man for himself that creates conditions of poverty, destruction, and violence. So in terms of what the global African refugee crisis looks like, right now in the Mediterranean Sea, on a weekly basis, dozens of African people attempt to sail from Northern Africa and make their way to Europe, and dozens of African people drown in the Mediterranean Sea. This is happening on a weekly basis. Most recent estimates say an average of 1,800 migrants from Africa try to make this journey across the Mediterranean Sea and drown. There's actually a Twitter account, I'll put it in the comments later, but there's a Twitter account that'll post just like the death counts, like every time someone drowns and their body is found, this Twitter account will post it. And it's just like it comes up on my feed and I'll see it. And like that's like the most visibility that it tends to get because they don't talk about it in the news. And it's just like really wild because it'll be like 5 people, 50 people, 100 people. Sometimes they'll have pictures of a body and it's just like a little kid on like the shores of Italy. So yeah, it's just like a constant, constant wave of death. African people fleeing their homes, trying to cross the Mediterranean, dying, washing up on the shores of European countries. This has been happening for quite some time, where these small European towns and villages on the Mediterranean coast are just having like corpses wash up on the shore. It's like known this is happening. And the European nations have adjusted their immigration policies to exacerbate the problem. Europe is the OG racist. Europe is xenophobic as hell. As soon as it became clear that the consequence of European imperialist policy in Africa was this attempt for African people to make it to Europe, Europe automatically shut down its borders. So it made the immigration policy even tighter, made it even harder for African people to make it to Europe, and thus forced them into a situation where they would have to take this journey where they would most likely end up dead. That situation we find ourselves in. There are thousands of Africans dying on a yearly basis in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to make it to Europe. This is happening with the full awareness of authorities in European nations and the European Union, and their response was not to attempt to stop this death happening on their shores, but instead to make it harder for those African people to make it to within their borders. This is the consequence. An average of 1,800 migrants from Africa die in the Mediterranean Sea by drowning each year, and this is a result of intentional policy on the part of European Union, and also the result of Western imperialism in Africa. On the U.S.-Mexico border, we are seeing concentration camps, like literal concentration camps, being built on both the U.S. side and the Mexico side. We are seeing massive migrant caravans traveling north from Central and South America, trying to make it to the U.S.-Mexico border. We are seeing African and Caribbean and Central and South American migrants being caught up in places like Mexico under barbaric conditions because the U.S., quite like Europe, has adjusted its immigration policy to make it impossible for anyone to be legally allowed into the United States. Seeking asylum, migration is a human right, but imperialist powers around the world are working intentionally to lock down their borders, even though they know on the other side there is this massive humanitarian crisis, and even though they know this massive humanitarian crisis is a direct consequence of their own actions. Because the reason why African people, Central and South American people from all over the world are piling up on the U.S.-Mexico border is a direct consequence of U.S. imperialist policies all around the world. For example, the U.S. government overthrew Haiti's government several times. They overthrew Aristide multiple times, two times, like we talked about in the show. Every time the Haitian people rise up and push out some imperialist puppet, the United States comes through with another one to repress the Haitian people. The United States has invested millions of dollars in keeping Haiti basically a narco state where gangs operate with impunity, where the government is not able to function to provide for the basic needs of the people, where basically it's an unlivable situation. The U.S. did this in order to allow Haiti to remain its personal plantation. And so, of course, Haitian people who are trying to live, who love their home, who love their people, but want to survive, flee Haiti to try to make it to the United States. And the United States is like, you know what? You can't come in. We're going to attack you with dudes on horses. We're going to corral you in concentration camps during a global pandemic. We are going to deport you by the thousands. Like, if you manage to make it across the border, we will stick you in a detention facility without any access to a lawyer, and then we'll bring it in front of a judge who speaks a language you don't understand, and then we'll put your ass on a plane back to Haiti. This is how the United States is dealing with a problem that it created. And Haiti is just one example. We've already talked about Honduras. The U.S. coup in Honduras had created the very first migrant caravans. We've already talked about U.S. imperialism targeting Grenada. We talked about U.S. imperialism targeting Venezuela, targeting Nicaragua, targeting all of these nations trying to resist imperialism. And the way that the U.S. chooses to respond by making conditions unlivable in these countries creates the migration crisis, creates the refugees. So in the, I guess it's still the Western Hemisphere, but in Europe's borders and in the U.S.'s borders, and also, by the way, in Israel's borders, we have these situations where people are fleeing conditions created by Western imperialism, and these imperialist powers respond by making it impossible for these refugees to actually gain access to the wealth that was stolen from them in these imperialist nations. It is an intentional strategy. They are intentionally creating the conditions that drive migration and intentionally cutting off access to the resources people are fleeing their homes to get. This is what's happening. So, the old global African refugee crisis exists in the Mediterranean Sea. It exists on the U.S.-Mexico border. It exists in occupying Palestine that is suffering under Zionist rule. Wherever we see what we referred to in the previous episode a couple of months ago as the walled world, wherever we see these nations that have become superpowers, that have become wealthy by looting and colonizing the rest of the world, we also see refugees piled up at a militarized border. It's happening all over this planet, and a significant portion of those refugees are African people, because Africa is the epicenter of global imperialism. So let's get into why this is happening. Like I said, imperialism makes conditions unlivable, but I want to talk a little bit more detail about what that means. Like, understand the reason why people are fleeing their homes, the reason why this refugee crisis exists is bottom line because of capitalist exploitation. It's because of the global system of imperialism that seeks to privatize the entire planet to make a handful of people wealthy. Like, that's what it is. It is capitalist exploitation that is driving this refugee crisis, whether it's people coming from Haiti, whether it's people coming from Zimbabwe, whether it's people coming from Venezuela. It's all happening for the same reason, y'all. It is the capitalist system. The walled world, the nations of Europe, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Australia, they work to create militarized borders surrounding these fortress nations that have built their wealth on the backs of colonization and theft and slavery. These nations are superpowers, are the so-called first world, because they have stolen the wealth of Africa. They have stolen the wealth of Central and South America. They have stolen the wealth of much of Asia and the Caribbean. That is why the United States is rich. That is why Europe is rich. Everything they are, everything they built was stolen from Africa and the rest of the colonized world. So these nations like looted, enslaved, raped, and stole their way to becoming first world powers, to becoming superpowers. And then they understand that they've gotten to the position they are by exploiting the vast majority of the rest of the planet. And they're like, wow, what if those people like come for their stuff? We should build extremely militarized borders. We should build a global network of surveillance and control. We should train police and military forces in strategies of repression and violence so that when these people come knocking, when these people come for what is actually theirs, they'll be repelled by force. That is what the walled world does, and that is how it uses the IPIC, which is, again, the Industrial Police Military Intelligence Complex. Walled world steals the wealth. Then they build up their big walls with like barbed wire and cops and pigs and spies to keep us out, to keep the people they stole from away from that stolen wealth. The other thing, like I mentioned, is that we had our own completely humanistic ways of living. I don't want to romanticize pre-colonial Africa and say there were no contradictions around class or around gender. But the point I do want to make is that before colonization came to Africa, we as societies organized in such a way that people's basic needs were met, that people were not going hungry, that people were not homeless, where there wasn't pervasive gender-based violence, where children were protected, where families were intact, whatever families happened to look like. Before colonization came to Africa, we had functioning humanistic societies. Colonizers came, they stole the land, they stole the resources, they stole our labor, but they also worked systematically to destroy pre-colonial African and indigenous societies. They destroyed our understandings of gender. They destroyed our understandings of faith and spirituality and religion. They destroyed our ways of organizing our societies, and instead they imposed their own ways, which were specifically developed to allow for exploitation. So before we had humanistic and collective values, they imposed individualist and profit-centered values instead. Where before we had matriarchies, where women women and marginalized gender people had positions of respect and leadership, where men were never oppressed. You will never find a matriarchal society in pre-colonial Africa where men were systemically oppressed. It just did not happen. They destroyed matriarchal societies. They imposed patriarchal societies. They denigrated women. They pushed us into a subordinate position. They criminalized all expressions of queer and gender variant African identity. They basically worked systematically to destroy all the things that made our societies function in a humanistic way in order to facilitate our exploitation. And so the consequence of that has been a significant impact on our understandings as African people, on what gender means, on what class means, and what family means. It has led to the abandonment of social and communal principles that are grounded in African culture. It has led to the abandonment of basic morality rooted in African culture. Amilcar Cabral, who is the founder of the PIGC, or one of the founders of the PIGC, which is the revolutionary organization that helped liberate Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese colonialism, he described the process of colonization as removing us as colonized people from history and putting us into the history of colonial powers. And I feel like that's a very accurate way of describing that process, because they really destroyed or worked to destroy the roots of who we are, to transform those roots into something dysfunctional and destructive. And so that's where we find ourselves. We were forced to adopt value systems created by colonizers that had no relationship whatsoever to how we understood ourselves and our culture. These foreign values deliberately created obstacles to African unity and unity between colonized peoples. It caused us to question our identity. It caused us to transform the respect and love and cooperation we had amongst ourselves into disruption, division, and destructive relationships. And now we see what that looks like. Now we see that the ultimate consequence of how colonizers impose their values upon us is war. And the number one victims of that process among African people are women, marginalized gender folks, and kids. For example, in Ethiopia, Sudan, the Congo, and Nigeria, women and girls are kidnapped and murdered by other African people at an alarming rate. Women and youth make up most of the African world population, and we are also the primary victims of war, migration, and poverty. In 2019 and 2020, there were 53,000 incidents of sexual violence reported in Tanzania alone. In one nation, there were over 53,000 incidents of sexual violence targeting women and children in just one African nation, an average of 146 incidents each day. When their war breaks out in Africa, when imperialism works to create unlivable conditions, the impact is felt most acutely by the most oppressed segments of African society. And those most oppressed segments happen to be women, marginalized gender folks, and children. And unfortunately, oftentimes the violence suffered by those groups is brought down upon them by other African people. So war in Africa, which is again not something that's intrinsic to African people in any way, shape, or form, but which was created by the conditions imposed upon us by colonization that destroyed our indigenous ways of being, has caused people to flee their homes, has caused African people to flee their homes all over the continent and all over the diaspora. And the majority of the people that are fleeing, the majority of the people that are facing violence and devastation and poverty are the most marginalized sectors of our society, which are, again, women, marginalized gender people, and youth, children. So war has destabilized the African continent. War has destabilized millions of African people, including families and children. There are more African people living outside their country of birth than any other continent. So this is the face of what colonization has done to Africa. Additionally, as we speak, there are at least 15 civil wars or border wars occurring in the African continent today. However, what this means is that African nations and African people are fighting over borders that we did not even create. We didn't even make the borders that we are fighting over. The borders that currently exist in Africa today were created at the Berlin Conference by European powers in 1884. They were drawn for the explicit purpose of dividing Africa's wealth and resources amongst these colonial powers. They literally sat down, like Germany, Belgium, Britain, France, Italy, sat down and were like, okay, you get this, I get this, I want that, can we go here? Like, they literally like split up Africa. They called it a divine African cake. They're going to take all the resources, they're going to take the slices for themselves. There was no Africans at that meeting. We had no say whatsoever in how those borders were drawn. But then 200 years later, we find ourselves fighting amongst ourselves thanks to the impact of those borders on the continent, thanks to the impact of imperialism. So the conditions for war on the African continent were created by foreign domination. It's nothing intrinsic to us. It's not that we can't get it together, that this was deliberately done to us to facilitate our exploitation, y'all. Woo! So do you understand why one of the demands of the APRP is to get rid of all the colonial borders? That we can't be fighting over things that we didn't create. We can't be fighting over borders that are not even ours. We can't be like enforcing, saying like if you're an African from this puppet nation, you can't come to this puppet nation. Absolutely not. Like the whole African continent belongs to all African people. We can't defend these borders against each other. That makes no sense. But the consequence of this war, of this foreign domination, of imperialist intervention in African countries, of this global economic system of capitalism that prioritizes profit over life, is the conditions of extreme instability that lead women and children and people, African people, to flee their homes in search of life, in search of opportunities, which is leading to a massive brain drain from African nations. Like if someone is a skilled worker in an African nation, if they are a doctor, if they are a lawyer, if they are an engineer, they are much more likely to find opportunity outside of their home in the West than they are in Africa. So it's leading to a massive brain drain. And it's also feeding the labor base of the very same capitalist countries that created these conditions in the first place. When these lawyers, these doctors, these teachers, engineers, skilled workers of all kinds flee Africa for the West, they are helping to build up the West. Do you understand why this is such a massive problem for the African continent? We are literally building the labor base of the very countries that are oppressing and exploiting us with this refugee crisis. So yeah, it's a messed up situation, not of our creation, that has been exacerbated by the process. It was started with the process of primitive accumulation, with the colonization of Africa, with the slave trade, but it continues in the present day while Africa is still being exploited by the capitalist system. So what do we do about it, right? There's a lot of problems, like the African people dying in the Mediterranean make me lose my composure. When I think about it, I get really sad. When I think about the Africans at the U.S.-Mexico border, when I think about the deportations of Africans from Haiti, I just get upset, like mad. And sometimes when you have like are reading about these things and like learning about them, it's like hard to like look beyond the present moment at what it is we have to do. But it's very essential for us to center, like, how can we address these problems? Like, don't just like focus on how bad it is, but think about how we can change things. And thankfully, the APRP and Revolutionary Pan-Africanism as a movement and as an objective have the solutions to these problems. What we need to end the global African refugee crisis is worldwide African unity, a liberated socialist Africa. We need revolutionary Pan-Africanism. The key to worldwide Pan-African unity, the key to building a unified socialist Africa, can be clearly observed in Africa's history. Like I already said, Africa has a whole long history. Long before colonizers came to our shores, we had developed societies. We had our own cultural practices. We had our own systems of morality. We had our own principles. We had our own ways of organizing society that were rooted in who we are as African people. We already had that for the majority of our existence. It's only this small, horrible, recent chunk where all of a sudden those things don't seem to exist anymore. But if we study our history, if we study how our societies were organized before, if we study who we were before, then we can find the keys, the roots that we can use to build African unity in the modern day. If we had African unity before, If we had open borders before, if we had freedom to travel as African people, if we had societies organized around life where people had their basic needs met, if we were able to do that before for thousands of years, that means that we could do it again. It means that it's possible for it to be built now, regardless of what's been imposed upon us, that it can be done again. So we must focus on learning that history. And we can't just say that we're going to attempt to copy and paste what happened 2,000 years ago on today and hope for that to work. No, we have to study that history to understand how we can develop it into the future. We have to build the ideological and political development of the masses of African people. We have to teach the masses of our people to reject the values of these capitalist imperialist systems. These are not African values. These are anti-life values that are genocidal, that are profit-driven. We have to tell our people that we cannot internalize the values of the system that oppressed us, that we must build our own, rooted in our African culture, rooted in our identity as African people. We have to understand that we, as African people, we are not our enemies. We have no business whatsoever fighting each other over borders drawn by imperialist powers. We have no business whatsoever as African people living in imperialist countries in any way, shape, or form denigrating African people that are trying to migrate to these countries. Like the ADOS movement, the Foundational Black American movement, all these like xenophobic as heck so-called African movements are a rejection of fundamental African principles, of fundamental African morality. That is white people stuff in blackface. Like that is what ADOS is. There's nothing black or African about it. That is white people stuff. We have no right whatsoever as African people living in empire saying that we reject the right of African people to migrate here. No, not when the entire economy, the entire wealth of these imperialist nations is built on a foundation of stolen African resources and labor. Absolutely not. Those people are coming for what belongs to them. They have a right, if they want to migrate to the United States, to do that. And we should be saying, open up the doors, open up the borders, let them in. We should not be saying, that's mine. No, like absolutely not. It makes no sense. We have to reject these colonizer values, these white people values. We have to embrace other African people, understand that our identity is not tied to the U.S. empire. Identity is tied to the African continent. The rest of the African diaspora, we understand those people are family. They have a right to be here. They have a right to what's theirs. We have to align ourselves with them. We also have to build revolutionary African organizations that can work to rebuild, to reconstruct revolutionary African culture. Because right now we got the NAACP, ADOS, the Congressional Black Caucus, all of these like coon-ass formations that are completely aligned with the empires that are oppressing our people. We have like Travis Scott's and like the Carters and like the Obamas that are telling us to aspire to wealth, that are telling us to assimilate into white supremacist capitalist culture. Like this is the leadership that exists in the present day. These are the organizations that are saying they are leading our people. All of them are compromised. All of them are sold out. And so what we need is actually revolutionary African organizations that are aligned with the African continent and the masses of African people that are not trying to get a seat at the colonizer's table, but that are trying to burn the table down. So the All People's Revolutionary Party is one such revolutionary African organization working to build a revolutionary African culture. Black Alliance for Peace, that is reconstructing the legacy of revolutionary African internationalism, is another example. Ojima People's Progress Party, Hood Communists, the Low Country Action Committee that are Comrade Sally who is in. There's all these organizations. There's a Mapanduzi in I believe in North Carolina. There's all these revolutionary organizations like working in pockets to rebuild revolutionary African culture, to build a revolutionary African movement. And this is where we need to invest our energy, our capacity, and our resources. Not into these formations, into these figures that are trying to assimilate us into capitalism and into the organizations that are trying to burn capitalism down. Period. This is what we need to build. More things like that. Stop trying to get a seat at the slave master's table and take the whip and beat the shit out of him. That's what you need to do. Anyway, so we need to build revolutionary African organizations. We need to reconstruct revolutionary African culture. We have to build a strong ideological, political, and ethical foundation for a new African society. We have to align ourselves with the masses of our people and our home and not these empires oppressing and exploiting us. We also have to build our own system of ethics, our own understanding of morality, of ethics, rooted in our revolutionary African culture. And the reason why we have to do that is because I have noticed, and perhaps y'all have noticed as well, that we have begun to internalize the values and ethics and morality of this system founded in genocide, slavery, and theft. And how that's showing up is that, for example, Travis Scott, who, I'm going to be honest with you, I have never heard a song by this man. I just know he's dating one of the Kardashians, and he has like a very large following that apparently is very like cultish. It seems cultish. But anyway, so he had a concert like last weekend in Houston where they drastically oversold tickets in the middle of a pandemic. It was way too many people in that space, mostly young people. And at some point during the show, there was like a rush to the stage, and people started getting like trampled and crushed. 8 people ended up dying. And to me, it's clear that doing that during a pandemic was messed up. Selling that many tickets in a space where there clearly wasn't enough room was messed up. The security protocols were clearly all messed up. And Travis Scott himself created an environment where that kind of behavior was expected, which is also messed up. But in the aftermath of those people dying, what I immediately saw was folks like jumping to be like, don't blame Travis Scott, like defending this man. And I was like, why? Like, why? Like, first of all, he's having a concert full of thousands of people in the middle of a pandemic where it's mostly African and colonized people dying. So that's like on his face messed up. But second of all, it's like a wealthy ass person choosing to do this, knowing that he has this fan base that's going to do whatever he says and creating the conditions for this to happen. So at the like, even if you don't think he's primarily responsible, even if you think it's mostly up to the organizers of the concert and the venue, like that's cool. But that's not a situation where you should defend the wealthy person in the front. But what people were doing was saying, oh, it's like a black man, that's an African man, and they're scapegoating him. And I was like, that definitely happens, but not to rich people. It was just very strange to me because it was like a warped presentation of like nationalist sentiment organized in defense of a wealthy man who at best made a series of poor profit-driven decisions that led to the deaths of several people, young people. But we see ourselves as African people, we don't see ourselves in like the 8 dead anymore. We see ourselves in Travis Scott. And so we organize to defend people like Travis Scott, people like Jay-Z, people like Beyonce, Diddy, T.I., Killer Mike. We see ourselves in them, even though they are not in any way, shape, or form representative, and we'll defend them. We don't see ourselves in the people that were trampled. And I feel like that's like a small example of how this system, this capitalist imperialist system, has warped what we believe to be is right and wrong, has warped our sense of ethics. We will always defend like the rich person. Oh, it was another thing I saw in Eswatini in Swaziland. There are protests against the monarchy. It's the last absolute monarchy in Africa. There are masses of people in the streets protesting. I was watching videos about it because we want to have them on the show on the next episode. So I was like trying to learn about it. And in the comments of one of the videos, there was like several African people in the United States being like, leave him alone. Like, that's like, so, oh, we have like the last African king and y'all have to like be in his face. Like, let him be in power, because they thought that he was being attacked because he was an African king. Because we have been taught to identify with the king, to identify with the rich person, to identify with the powerful person, and not with like the mass of people getting trampled or protesting. It's very like, I don't know like when that started happening, but it's very apparent to me that's like a real thing where African people, particularly in the West, in the United States, have been taught to identify with power if it has a black face. and to ignore or to denigrate the people that are resisting power. So yeah, it's really bad. It's bad. It's a bad situation. So we need to reconstitute, to reconstruct an African-centered, an African-rooted understanding of ethics and morality, to say that the needs of the collective should supersede the needs of individual power, to say that any kind of power that exists that's about domination and exploitation, we do not support. It should not matter if the rich person who organized the concert where people got trampled is an African person. It should not matter if the king is an African person. We should still align ourselves with the masses and not with them, and not with them. But capitalist indoctrination, the consequence of colonization, destroying our African culture, our African societies, has created this environment where we are seeing ourselves aligned with power. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, we got to rebuild those African ethics, that African morality. We have to understand what is right and what is wrong, and have that be grounded in African culture and not the culture of the colonizer, not the culture of capitalism and imperialism. So yeah. And then also, we have to build revolutionary leaders, leaders of the people, leaders of the masses that come from the masses, and not these puppets that are continuously imposed upon us. Like if you see someone getting a McDonald's deal, that's not a person that's on your side. If you see a person making it to the office of the US president, that is not a person that's on your side. These people that are being elevated to positions of leadership and influence and wealth within the capitalist system are not leaders for us. Those are not leaders that come from the revolutionary African tradition. Those are leaders that are deliberately cultivated by capitalism and imperialism to pacify us, to keep us from resisting this system. That's why those people are there. I don't care who it is. I don't care if you like them or not. I'm sure people are probably mad about what I said about Travis Scott, but he's an example. Like, those people that are elevated to those positions in this particular society are not the leaders we need. We have to develop our own leaders rooted in revolutionary African principles, cultures, and organization. That means developing youth, developing women, developing marginalized gender Africans, developing African men into revolutionary leaders that are part of revolutionary organizations, that are accountable to the masses of their people, that are grounded in an African-centered understanding of ethics, moralities, and principles. Period. We have to build those people. This society is not going to produce those leaders for us. We must build the spaces where those leaders will be developed. And like I said, the APRP is one such space, but there are many African organizations that are doing that work. The problem is that we see the Travis Scott and we ignore the rest of those people, and it's very bad. So we have to build our own revolutionary organizations that are capable of developing revolutionary African leaders, that are capable of reconstructing a revolutionary African society, that are capable of developing our own understanding of ethics, morality, and principles that are separated from this capitalist imperialist system. All of that we want to do because we want to build a one liberated, unified, socialist Africa. We want to win the objective of Pan-Africanism, which is, again, one unified socialist Africa. And the reason why we want to do that is because a unified socialist Africa, an Africa where the land and resources and labor of the continent are collectively and democratically controlled by the masses of African people, that would be a superpower, y'all. That would be a superpower that we have not yet experienced. It would be a force for good on this planet that the rest of the world would be forced to contend with. I got into like a debate with some Afro-pessimists the other day, where one of them was like, the ultimate objective of the African liberation struggle should be to end anti-Blackness. And I was like, I do not agree. And the reason why I do not agree is because anti-Blackness, while certainly supported by these structures of capitalism and imperialism, certainly created by the system of capitalism and imperialism, is just a symptom of a larger problem. The reason why African people are exploited, the reason why African people are oppressed, the reason why thousands of African people are fleeing our homes all over this continent, trying to find a way to survive, is because Africa itself is exploited and colonized. Africa's exploitation forms the foundation of the global capitalist system. We are not free as African people on this planet because Africa itself is not free, because our mother, our home, is not free. And so my understanding of what the objective of the African liberation struggle is not about addressing a singular symptom. It's like if you got like the flu, or like, what's a better, if you got like some deadly disease for which there was a clear cure, and instead of like taking the cure, you just like treated like your headache. Like instead of like dealing with the disease itself, you just treated the symptoms. Like that's what that's like. I think that what we need to do is work to liberate and unify Africa, work to eradicate the borders created by colonial powers, work to fight for reparations, not just for slavery, but for the ongoing colonization of Africa, work to make sure that every single African person around this planet has the right to repatriation on the African continent. That to me is like the clear objectives of the African liberation struggle. We're not treating the symptoms, we have to treat the root of the problem, which is the exploitation and colonization of Africa. If you treat the root of the problem, what happens to the symptoms? Certainly, anti-African attitudes will probably still exist after Africa is unified, liberated, and socialist. But if Africa is a global superpower, if the masses of African people collectively and democratically control our vast wealth, if every single African person has access to healthcare, to housing, to safety, to education, to self-determination, then what difference would the existence of anti-African attitudes make to us? If some random European, or even several Europeans, or thousands of Europeans still maintain anti-African attitudes in a world where Africa is a superpower, then why would we have to deal with those attitudes? The reason why we're forced to deal with anti-blackness right now is because we have no power. They have all the power to impose that bullshit on us. We have no power to resist it. If we had a land base that we controlled, if we had wealth that we controlled, you would know how little we would have to deal with those attitudes. If someone came to us like you're an N-word and we were citizens of a global superpower, do you think that would matter? Do you think it would matter at all? It wouldn't matter it wouldn't matter what ideas were floating around our people's heads about our so-called inferiority, about, who we're supposed to be or what's supposed to think. If we had the power to make it so they could not impose those beliefs on us, it wouldn't matter what they think at all. I hope that makes sense. Anti-blackness is a symptom of a larger problem. Racist attitudes towards African people are a symptom of a larger problem. The larger problem is the colonization and exploitation of the African continent. If we want to get rid of those attitudes, we must first work to liberate and unify Africa. And then even though those racist attitudes still exist, we won't have to deal with them anymore. It took me a long time to understand what that meant because I was like indoctrinated into the idealistic, anti-materialist understanding of racism. Until one day in Ghana, a gentleman was like, do you know what happens when, say, like a Chinese person gets hit by a bus in the United States? What happens is that the Chinese government is like, tell us what happened, tell us why it happened, and tell us what you're gonna do about it. If a Chinese person has problems anywhere in the world, the people who cause the problems are going to have to deal with the Chinese government. This is what I mean. China used to be colonized by Britain, by the United States. The United States would very much like to colonize China again. But China had a whole ass revolution, y'all. Chinese people mobilized and organized on a mass basis to liberate their nation from foreign domination. And now China is a global power that throws its weight around on the world stage. The United States is constantly trying to pick a fight with China. But if you notice, they step carefully. They are very careful in how they deal with China because they know at this point, if they were to initiate a straight up pick a fight, it would not go their way. China forced these imperialist nations to deal with them on the terms that the Chinese set. There's no reason why could not be possible for all of us. That could not be possible for Africa or all colonized peoples. We have to stop focusing on the individual attitudes or even collective attitudes of our oppressors, of colonizers. And we have to focus on building our independent political power, focus on liberating our land, focus on liberating our resources, focus on liberating our labor. Period. If we build up the independent political power of Africa and African people, then it will not matter how people feel about us. It won't matter. They can think anything they want, but we will not have to deal with it any fucking more. So I would not say that the ultimate struggle or the ultimate objective of the African liberation struggle is to end anti-blackness or racism or any of those symptoms. The ultimate objective of the African liberation struggle must be grounded in the concrete conditions of the masses of African people, on transforming those conditions by liberating and unifying the continent. And if we undertake that work, if we make sure that every single African person has access to healthcare, has access to housing, has access to education, has access to independence and self-determination, that means that they will no longer have conditions in African nations that they have to flee. African people will not be fleeing their homes to die in the Mediterranean Sea, to be locked up in concentration camps on the U.S.-Mexico border. If we liberate and unify Africa, if we build African independent political power, if we make sure the wealth of Africa is used for the good of African people, then African people won't try to leave their homes anymore. The only reason I'm in the United States is because of the slave trade, but also because the United States kept overthrowing the Honduran government and created unlivable conditions. If Honduras had been livable, my people would never have left. We would never have left. So we have to work to make our homes livable, survivable, free. That's what we have to do. And for African people, that means building one unified socialist Africa, period. So yeah, I see y'all typing a lot, so let me see what y'all are saying. You can't organize the sleeping people. You have to wake them up then first, then you get some action. Yes, correct. Jose says sanctions are acts of war that attack economies and subsequently torture people. Sanctions are acts of war. Absolutely. The U.S. government tries to sell sanctions as a humane alternative to boots on the war invasion, or boots on the ground invasion. It's not true. Sanctions deliberately target the most vulnerable segments of a population. I'm talking about women. I'm talking about marginalized gender folks. I'm talking about kids. I'm talking about disabled people, elderly people. That is who suffers the most when a nation is under sanctions. That is who most acutely feels the impact of being denied access to resources and starvation. It is meant to target civilians. The United States will apply more sanctions on Cuba and say oh, we're targeting the minister, we're targeting the leadership. No. Whenever sanctions are applied, it's the regular people, not the government, that feel the most intense impact. Let me see. Mike says we got to come together to stop these things from happening. Absolutely. We as African people living in the belly of the beast have an obligation to show up in solidarity with the African refugees, with African immigrants that are trying to make it to these borders. Like I said, all of the wealth of the United States, all of the wealth of Europe, all of the wealth of Israel, as a matter of fact, was looted from the African continent. So when African people flee the continent because of Western imperialism to try to make it to Europe, to try to make it to the United States, we have to understand that they are literally just coming for what belongs to them. The wealth of these places was stolen from them. So if they come to get a little piece so they can live, they have every right. And we, as people oppressed by those empires living within the belly of the beast, have no right whatsoever to say they cannot do that. In fact, we should be pushing these governments to open the goddamn doors. Because if they allow those African immigrants in, those African refugees in, that's an opportunity for us to build with them, to recruit them into our organizations, to recruit them into the struggle to liberate Africa. I don't understand that, man. I don't understand anti-immigrant sentiments among African and colonized people in the United States. This government thinks you're a citizen in the first place. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And first chance they get, they're going to get rid of us. So I don't understand why you try to hug Uncle Sam while he's kicking these people in the face. Uncle Sam is not about to stab you in the back. It makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense. It's suicidal, actually. So yeah. Lots of highs. I'm glad y'all are talking to each other in the chat. It's cute. KD reinforcing these borders were not of our making. Yeah, the current state of African nations fighting each other over borders created by colonizers is disgraceful. Before the show, I was also reading about, the phenomenon of xenophobia in Azania in South Africa, and how, African people come from other nations to Azania to find work, and how the neo-colonial government in Azania will demonize those people, and the massive people in Azania respond with violence against those people. I was reading about that, and I was that is disgraceful, because When Azania was fighting against the apartheid government, when Azania was fighting for national liberation, the entire African continent unified to support the anti-apartheid struggle. Like all of Africa showed up for Azania's liberation. And now in 2021, the neocolonial government is like scapegoating African refugees from other countries created by imperialism. I'm just like, damn, that's ungrateful. Anywho, but that's how imperialism works. That's how neocolonialism works. I don't want to like demonize African people in Azania. Like that was created by imperialism. Xenophobia was created by imperialism. It's divide and conquer shit to keep us fighting amongst ourselves. That's what that is. It can be destroyed, but first we have to call it out. The Divine Nine are part of this Black Mish leadership. Is that like the fraternities and sororities? I don't know, man. I didn't go to college. Well, I went to college for like one semester, then I dropped out. So I don't know what that is. But I think it's the fraternities and sororities, in which case I agree with you. If you're talking about the HBCUs, I also agree with you. Actually, on Hood Communists, I think like last week we put up a really great article written by the Black Alliance for Peace, Mid-Atlantic region, talking about how these historically Black colleges and universities in the United States have very deep roots in the military-industrial complex or in the IPIC, and how they are creating a whole new generation of sellout leaders in the United States. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's damn, like that's another, those are more institutions that we're told are producing the leaders that African people need. Meanwhile, they're working with the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, like all of these genocidal military and surveillance spy agencies to repress African and colonized people. Like it's just like, damn, like we cannot get our leaders from this system, whether they're coming from an HBCU, whether they're coming from pop culture, whether they're coming from like the Congressional Black Caucus. Like those are not our leaders. We cannot accept those leaders. We must make our own. Those people are gonna sell us out. Solidarity from Sri Lanka. That's dope. That's amazing. Thank you, Onye, for dismantling the table discourse and showing its ideological and capitalist moorings. No folks crashed the gates to get in. They didn't have security to stop the people from coming in. Yeah. Oh yeah, you're talking about the Travis Scott thing. Yeah, I saw some of the videos of like people jumping the gates, and I am generally like pro jumping the gates, especially at like overpriced like experiences like that. But yeah, that was just like very clearly poorly organized. People did not have to die. And now like watching in the aftermath, people like blaming the crowd, which if you understand how things like that happen, like how those crushes happen, how like the trampling happens, like once you're in it, it's like the whole crowd is moving as like one force. There's nothing any individual person can do. It was the lack of organization. It was the fact that that shit was even allowed to go on at all that caused that situation. So Travis Scott's responsible, the organizers of the festivals were responsible, but the attendees are actually like the least at fault because they were just, once it started happening, they were like along for the ride. It wasn't up to them to stop as individuals because they couldn't have. And also someone saying Travis Scott's celebrity exists on exploitation and oppression. His celebrity isn't aimed at the empire, and that's enough. He's also said, like, if you like read a little bit about him, he said like anti-BLM things. He said like Mike Brown had it coming. He's dating a Kardashian, which is always an indication of some like sunken place stuff. So the man is just not, like, the amount of love and loyalty he's getting in the aftermath has not been earned, is the nice way to say that. He is not fit to be in the position he holds. Let me see. Anything else? I see some smoke for ADOS. I appreciate that. Let me see. Okay, cool. All right. I appreciate all this discourse. Oh yeah, China doing big things. They are undoing deserts right now. What is the U.S. doing? Well, the U.S. is attacking socialist projects throughout the Western Hemisphere. That's what the U.S. is doing. The U.S. is incapable of helping its people survive a pandemic. It's incapable of providing basic needs for people living in the United States, like healthcare, like housing. We don't get that shit. What the U.S. is focused on is attacking Cuba, attacking Nicaragua, attacking Venezuela, and generally just being a force for evil on the global stage. The U.S. is like, we don't care if you live or die. We are focused on destroying socialism. That is what the U.S. is doing right now. Oh yeah, one tactic colonizers use is to categorize and conquer. We have to learn to break out of the mold that they create. I absolutely agree. Let me see. Okay, y'all. So I'm going to stop because there's so many good comments and I can't read them all. But I deeply appreciate all of the conversations that have been happening in the chat and all of the thoughts that y'all are sharing. It's really great. We have a very good audience. But yeah, that's the global African refugee crisis. We got to fight for a unified socialist Africa. We have to fight to reconstruct revolutionary African culture period. Because we have internalized a lot of extremely questionable, antisocial, anti-human values from this capitalist imperialist system. We have to reject integration into that system. We have to reject the values of that system. We have to understand that we are African people. Our destiny is connected to our home. Our destiny is connected to each other. We have a responsibility and a loyalty to each other that must be rebuilt. So this is what we got to do. Fight for one unified socialist Africa, period, and screw this place in its eyes. Cool. And Mike says, forget these celebrities, it's up to us. That's a good place to end that. I agree. So that was the PE section of the show. I'm glad that y'all were participating. You seem to get a lot out of it, so we appreciate you. But we're going to keep it moving so we can wrap up within 90 minutes. So let's get into what's happening here in Tijuana territory in New Mexico chapter. We shouldn't even call ourselves New Mexico chapter because now we have a member in Colorado and another member in Utah. So we're like Southwest. We're Southwest chapter. Okay, but it's cool. Anyway, but specifically in New Mexico, where most of our members are located, the Pan-African Community Garden has wrapped up for the season. The planting part is done. We just got very basic watering still happening, but we're not going to be doing events for the most part for the rest of the year. Probably not until the spring because it's cold, y'all. It's very cold. So most likely we will not be having more events at the garden until next year. We are planning to begin work on a shade structure, I believe, shortly. We're just buying the materials. And that might be like a community project, or we might try to do with APIP members. We'll let you know. But we have had an incredible season at the garden. We have learned so much together. We have grown incredible things. Like the Pan-African Community Garden with like no running water on the lot did so much better than my home garden. Like I have never in my life, and I've tried many times, I have never in my life successfully grown broccoli. I was like, maybe it's just impossible for me. And in the garden, we accidentally grew it. We thought they were collards. We had them out in like the beating sun since April, living in like 100-degree days, just like picking off the leaves and eating them because they thought we were collard greens. And then as soon as the temperatures dropped, they started forming broccoli heads. I don't know if y'all understand. Like I was so amazed because it's so hard to grow it. And we did it by accident with collective work and love. Like that's the kind of thing. We grew goji berries. We like got one plant stolen, got another plant donated, and successfully grew goji berries. We grew okra, we grew tomatoes, we grew peppers, we grew cucumbers. Now we're growing beets and carrots and greens. Like y'all, we put like $50 total into this garden out of pocket. And the rest of it was built from the ground up with collective action and organization. It is so incredible. We built a fence with pallets after watching a YouTube video. Like, it's just amazing. Like, you really, like, when you start doing these, like, kind of community defense projects where you don't have grants, where you don't have, like, professional training, and you're just, like, working together to figure out how to do it, you start to realize what we could be capable of if we were actually organized. We literally took an abandoned lot and turned it into a thriving community garden in 3 months and $50. And just like a lot of love and a lot of community. If we can do that on that lot with like 20 people, imagine what we could pull off if we organize the masses of African people. There's like nothing we couldn't do. Once I built the school and then the breakfast program and then the garden, like you could not tell me that we could not do anything we wanted, including build a unified socialist Africa if we were organized. So it's just been a very beautiful experience, and we can't wait to be out there again with y'all next spring. And we thank all the people so much that came through and helped us build it, like donated tools, donated food, donated childcare. Like it was just so beautiful. And it shows you what we are capable of when we are organized around life instead of around profit. So thank y'all. Also, today actually, this afternoon at 5 o'clock Mountain Time, we are having with the Anti-War Coalition a panel discussion on anti-communism and imperialism, specifically talking about how the imperialist system deliberately spreads and weaponizes anti-communism to attack social justice movements, whether they are communist or not. It's going to be a great discussion among comrades from the Black Alliance for Peace, specifically Erica Keynes, comrade from Post-Communist, the Black Alliance for Peace. Also, Oliver Baker, who, if you are local to Tijuana territory, you know he is one of the founders of the John Brown Breakfast Club here. He then moved to Pennsylvania and started another organization, Allegheny's Abolition, because it's a real one. He's going to be on the panel as well. Also, our comrade Ramiro Funes from Unmasking Imperialism, and also that documentary about Nicaragua, which you should watch. He's going to be on the panel as well. And we have a keynote speech from Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly of the Black Alliance for Peace, talking about anti-communism and how they have used it to attack African revolutionary organizing in the United States. So it's going to be a really good time. We're going to be talking about why anti-communism exists, what it looks like, how imperialism weaponizes it. So please come through. Registration is still open. We have, as of right now, like 90 registrations. I am shocked, but it's really cool. So please come through. I'm going to put the flyer at the end of the show with the registration link. Please visit that link and register and join us at 5 p.m. Mountain Time today. Also, this Saturday, November 13th, is the November edition of APM New Mexico's Pan-African Film Series. It's going to be screening at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. We're going to be showing a show about, a BBC documentary about Cuba's assistance with revolutionary African struggles against colonialism on the continent. It's called Cuba, ! Africa, ! Revolution, ! It's from back in a time when the BBC, for some reason, was telling the truth about Cuba. It's really weird, but it's accurate. It's historically accurate, so please join us for that film and the discussion about that film. I love talking about how Cuba has showed up for African revolutionary struggles because people always like to say Africa has no friends. And I'm like, Africa has at least one friend, and that friend is Cuba, and it's a beautiful history that is ongoing, so please join us to talk about it. Saturday, 2 p.m. Mountain Time, right here, the same place that you are watching the show. And then lastly, the National Venceremos Brigade, which is a solidarity delegation to Cuba, is organizing our very first conference. It is called Cuba, Land Back, and Environmental Justice. It is happening Saturday, November 27th from 10 a.m. Mountain Time to 4 p.m. Mountain Time, or 12 to 6 Eastern Time. It's going to feature 3 sessions. First session, I'm so excited. It's a panel discussion of revolutionary organizers from indigenous nations in the United States, from Zimbabwe, and from Cuba, talking about taking the land back as part of the process of building socialism and decolonization. Because Cuba did in fact take the land back. Zimbabwe took the land back. Indigenous nations in the United States are fighting for their land back. And taking the land back is an essential part of any revolutionary anti-colonial struggle. Also, despite the lies you might have heard from the imperialist system, it is usually successful. So we're going to be talking about land reform in Cuba. We're going to be talking about land reform in Zimbabwe. And we're going to be talking to indigenous organizers in the United States about why we take the land back here. It's going to be a good time. Second session is a seminar about Tarea Vida. Tarea Vida is also known as Project Life in English, and it's Cuba's 100-year plan to fight climate change. The fact that they have a plan, especially living in the belly of the beast, where these people are talking out of one side of their mouths about a Green New Deal, on the other side, they open up all these meetings for drilling, building all these pipelines. It's just so wild to me how the Democratic Party talks out of both sides of its face about climate change while making it worse. And then people think they're the Green Party. I'm like, y'all are out of your mind. But Cuba has an actual plan to deal with climate change that is 100-year-long plan. They are planning 100 years into the future to fight climate change. It's out of control, but we're going to learn about it in detail in a seminar at the VB conference. It's going to be great. And then the last session is a workshop on how you can organize a Cuba Solidarity car caravan in your city. All over the United States, members of the Venceremos Brigade have been organizing Cuba Solidarity car caravans on the last Sunday of each month. And you will hear from organizers in each area about how you can do it your very self. And by the time you leave that workshop, you will know how to organize a caravan of your own. So 3 sessions, 6 hours, 1 day, free. Completely free. So please join us. Again, that's happening Saturday, Saturday, November 27th, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to put up the flyer after the show that'll have the registration link. Please go through, register, join us. It's going to be so good. It's going to be so good. Like, I'm so excited about that panel with Zimbabwean, Cuban, and indigenous organizers talking about the land back. Like, I'm so excited. Because they be lying on land back, y'all, because they're so scared about it. So yeah, join us. So that was New Mexico chapter updates. Let's get into the closing. So speaking of COVID, remember, it's still a pandemic. It's still a pandemic. It is still a pandemic. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Dr. Fauci, all these raggedy ass people are saying it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. They're trying to scapegoat people who are skeptical about the vaccine for the continuance of the pandemic. That is not what actually happened. What actually happened is the U.S. failed at every single level through multiple administrations, first a Republican administration and now a Democratic administration, to create the programs that would allow people to survive this pandemic. They failed in every way, shape, or form to stop or control the spread of COVID-19 in the United States. To this day, no one has any real idea how many people have COVID-19 in the United States because there has not been at any time an organized response. The best they ever did, and this actually happened under Trump, was the lockdown and like the 2 checks. And that was deeply inadequate. And now we're in a situation where everything's open. There is no lockdown. There is no talk of stimulus. The eviction moratorium is gone. It's gone. All the safety measures that were in place to help people in any way, shape, or form are gone now. And the pandemic is still here. There's still a 9/11 happening every single week from deaths from COVID-19 in the United States. It is not a pandemic of the unvaccinated. It is a pandemic of all of us. It is still ongoing. So I know you're tired. I know you're tired because I am tired. I am so tired of this, but it's not over. When I leave my house, I put on a mask. When I hang out with people, I keep social distancing. I got both of those vaccines. When it's my turn in the line, I'll get the booster. Please understand, these people have left us to die, and so we have a responsibility to each other. Do not scapegoat people who are skeptical about the vaccine. That, again, is the consequence of systemic failures. It's not an individual problem. It's a systemic problem. So leave those people alone and instead focus your time on joining organizations fighting for justice, joining organizations that are building power to win the demands that we need to survive this pandemic. We need rent forgiveness. We need another lockdown. We need nationalized healthcare in the United States. We need a safety net so people can survive this pandemic. None of those things are coming from the top. None of those things will come from the top unless we demand them and we have the power to back those demands. So stop attacking each other. Stop tailing the ruling class and like letting them divide and conquer and have this fighting amongst ourselves. Instead, focus on building the movement that can demand the safety net that we need to survive this. Period. Also, today is Thursday, which means that there are new articles on Hood Communists. There are 4 new articles that I deeply encourage you to read. You can check them out at hoodcommunist.org. Also, we are, like I said, the show now happens on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of each month, which means next week there will be no show. But we'll be back on Thanksgiving, on November 25th, for an interview with organizers on the ground in Eswatini. We just had a comrade join the Work Study Circle who is from Eswatini, who is connected to folks who are involved in the uprising against the monarchy there. So we're going to be talking to them about what's going on and how we can support as Pan-Africanists. So tune in for that. Thursday, November 25th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And lastly, if you have enjoyed this program, or even if you haven't, if you can hear my voice, if you can see me, and you are not active in an organization fighting for justice, please, 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 comrade, join an organization fighting for justice. Join an organization that is fighting for the liberation of your people and of your land. Join an organization that is resisting these capitalist imperialist system that is fighting to build something better. If the organization you want to see does not exist, you can form that organization. You don't need formal training. You don't need money. You don't need any kind of experience. You just need like 2 friends and a book and bam, read that together. Figure out how you can apply the ideas you're reading about in the real world and then build those ideas. And you got an organization. You know that part? Actually, let me stop because sometimes I have like ADHD, so I go on like weird tangents. I have to control it. I was gonna make a pop culture reference, but I'm gonna stop it. But also want to make sure that as we're joining organizations, as we're building organizations, that we make sure that they have some aspect of organized political education that is mandatory for all the folks involved. It can look a lot of ways. It can be reading books together, it can be watching videos together, and you may be engaged in like workshops and seminars and all kinds of interactive ways of learning together. But no matter what it looks like, make sure that PE is there. PE, political education, is the foundation of revolutionary and radical work. Without that consciousness, without that critical thinking, you're going to end up doing a lot of random stuff that doesn't really amount to anything. That is the trade-off if you don't have PE. So make sure whether you're starting an organization or joining an organization, that organization has PE. Make sure that organization, whether you build it or join it, has a clear structure, particularly for leadership, that you understand. If there's a hierarchical structure for leadership, make sure it's clear how you get into it if you want to. If there's a horizontal flat structure, make sure you understand it. It can be explained to you. You also want to make sure whether you join or start an organization that you are allowed to dissent, that you are allowed to disagree and express that disagreement no matter who you are disagreeing with. I don't care if it's the founder of the organization. I don't care if they have like a fancy ass title, like chairman or whatever. It doesn't matter who they are. You should be able to disagree and dissent and express that respectfully. You should be able to no matter what. If you ever find yourself in an organization where you're not allowed to disagree with a certain person, that's a red flag. No PE is a red flag. No clear structure is a red flag. And not being able to disagree is a huge red flag. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you join or start an organization where if you want to develop your leadership skills, if you want to serve in a leadership role, that the infrastructure exists to allow you to do that. You don't ever want to find yourself in a situation where someone's like, I am the leader and you are the follower forever. That makes no sense. When I first joined the APRP, I would be like in calls, intimidated, scared to talk. But then after a while, when I started doing the reading and I started like understanding, I started talking a lot. And now they cannot make me stop talking. Like I'll be in meetings with people I've been in for like 50 years and I'll like disagree with them openly. I care like respectfully. I'll do it respectfully always because I love these people. But I'm not intimidated in any way, shape, or form. And when a leadership position is available, if I have capacity to do it, I will do it. And I'm encouraged to do that. And if like I need more skills to do it, then I am helped to develop those skills within the APRP. That is what you want to look for. You don't ever want to be in a situation where someone's like, you just cannot be a leader. That's not cool. It's not cool. We need to build a movement, a revolutionary mass movement where we have thousands of leaders, where people who, regardless of their gender, regardless of their age, regardless of their ability, are allowed to be that if they want to be. So please join our organization. If that organization you want to see does not exist, start that organization, and please keep in mind the things that you should look for to make sure that an organization is a good fit and is overall like a strong and healthy organization. Anywho, this has been Weekly Pan-African News. I'm Onya Sanmu of All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter. We want to thank you so much for joining us. Please join us at the film series this Saturday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, and we'll see you in 2 weeks on November 25th for the next edition of Weekly Pan-African News. Have a good day and stay tuned for some tunes and some flyers.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
Han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca. A la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus patas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
Y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana pa' Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí pa' cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. Oh, no. Hey. Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.